but they somehow lack the rigor or even in terms of practice definition for what it takes to sustain high maturity. Okay, that's the first premise. The second premise is there are far too many people issues that really affect and hurt the sustenance of high maturity than there are process issues. And based on these two premises, we will discuss some common ground on why the people factors become so important, whether it's low maturity or high maturity, and whether the CMMI Institute must be thinking about doing something with a very robust framework that they built in the SEI, called the People CMM, and bring it into context of the CMMI constellations, because this becomes a very critical piece of the puzzle that's missing. So I'll first of all set a broad background where we are going to discuss ideas, and you will be amazed and you'll be surprised that much of what we are talking of as people factors are actually organizational issues which you deal day in and day out. These are not something new, okay? It is just that we may not know that, oh, by the way, this was people CMM. So you will come to realize that there's a strong connect and that you're not going to be doing anything additional, but you're only going to streamline what you took for granted, okay? That's the fundamental thing that you will observe in this presentation. One of the reasons why I got thinking about kind of tapering down the people CMM from what is a 22 process area model to a 5 process area model is to kind of tell you that high maturity enactments will suffer both in the near term and in the long term if they don't take recourse to the people factors, okay? And there are 5 people CMM process areas which are in focus of this workshop, which will help you address how to sustain the gains that have been made once you have a high maturity process enactment. We will therefore look at what the characteristics of these 5 people CMM process areas are. Briefly, they are competency analysis, competency development, quantitative performance management, organizational capability management, and organizational process alignment. I will explain this in detail because these are the only 5 process areas that we are going to be focusing on. You will see that much of this is already embedded within the high maturity enactment, but then you need the people factor to actually bring the capability dimensions together. And how does this interweaving work? And I will speak to you from my experiences of having used the PCMM with the CMM first, and later on the CMMI constellations for close to 15 years now, and in 4 organizations which did high maturity implementation. So I'll give you case studies without naming the organization because we don't have permissions in place. But broadly, the definitions were pretty much based on Sitara proprietary work products, which I can share. And you'll also use this workshop to come up with a competency profile for one competency of your choice. And that'll be sometime around the mid-section of this workshop, okay? So I'll talk to you from another perspective, the business justifications. Why do you think you need to intervene people CMM to the CMMI constellations? So from the business justifications perspective. Conclusions, Q&A. By the way, Q&A, you can interrupt my presentation anywhere because I was just told that it's a 1 long hour presentation. Initially, this was planned for 45 minutes, so we have 15 more minutes. So please stop the presentation if you need any clarifications. Yeah. This is the thing that I often come to understand. Building high maturity process is the easy part. We all know what it needs to have as basic practices, and we know there are 4 process areas common to all the 3 CMMI constellations. You put them in place and you get your high maturity. But that's good so long as you have the staying power. It'll evaporate as quickly as you got your level if you don't focus on what we're going to talk about in this workshop, okay? The sustenance part is a more difficult aspect of high maturity implementation because this requires every individual in the organization to relentlessly question status quo and be able to respond to the never-ending next. And that requires you to come up with practices, which are the high maturity practices, down to the individual level. Individuals must be asking, how can I shift the average performance of my own capability to a better performance level? And then your process capability baselines may show some improvement, okay? So we are now asking for the constituents of the organization, which is the people, who are the learning aspect, to come up with techniques that they are going to use to constantly, relentlessly question status quo. And this therefore requires individuals to develop and improve competencies as much as improving the process. Organizational training is a process area which is common to all three constellations, but it's a very broad cookie cutter. It doesn't tell you what to train, how much to train, and do we have enough training, okay? So organizational training is not necessarily sufficient to grow all the competencies that you need in an organization. There's another important thing with the CMMI constellations. It tells you need quantitative techniques. It doesn't tell you how simplistic it can get, right? A simple quantitative technique, which you will soon appreciate now, is if you are able to have a measure for something called as an average, and then diffuse that average, because it's going to be a group of people who are going to perform to an average, and therefore you have a standard deviation. And just manage projects with simple averages and simple standard deviations, all of which is given by the practitioners of the organization. That's quantitative management, right? And you really don't expect organizations to give you breakthrough performance results. Now, what's the easiest way to bring down the variation? Ask everybody to perform at the average level. Don't be superhuman. Just perform at the average level. And if all of us start performing at the average level, and we all consciously know what that average goal is, you bring down variation. It's only then we talk of how do we make the average better, right? That's something that the PCMM addresses, but CMMI somehow misses the story, okay? It tells you only half of the story of what high maturity is, but I think PCMM completes the story. We'll see why. Now, we have within the three constellations of the CMMI, high maturity practices enacted in 4 process areas. And I kind of rehashed the purpose statements without quoting it exact. I might be wrong a little from the actual purpose statements, but this is exactly what OPP is all about. You use a quantitative understanding of the process to establish a performance baseline using which you model performance or the behavior of the process, right? So what does that mean? I have projects in execution. I ask each of the projects to collect defect density, and for some size measure, for best reasons known to mankind, line of code may be best size measure for code. I ask you to collect defect tendencies at the time of peer review and baseline of code. Okay, and you give me some defect tendencies for the projects that are in execution in our organization. Let's suppose that this is the organization. Each table can, give me a defect density measure for the projects that they are executing for the components at the lowest level, right? And if I were to stratify this in some sense, you use Agile, they use SDLC, somebody else uses Spiral, somebody else uses prototyping, and I ask you for these measures for a host of components that you have developed and take an average, what do I have? I have an average defect tendency measure as defects per K-log per project, and I stratify it per the life cycle, right? That's the process performance that is modeled and understood. That's OPP. Now, what I do is, I don't stop here. The next time around we have a project which has an agile component, I tell them, look, because our core competencies don't change by the day, odds are if you were to run your project, you're going to have X defects per K-log in your coding, right? So I set a goal. I set a goal based on historical tendencies of past performance behavior in the organization and execute and manage my projects based on these goals. That's QPM. Now, if I were to repeatedly do this meaning I set goals, I evaluate whether the goals are being achieved, and do this on a continuous basis, I get the next thing, which is performance management. Now, I want to emphasize this sequence because I have seen many high maturity, pseudo high maturity instantiations who do this first because they want to get to the level 5 tomorrow. And that's the wrong approach to take. You don't set your business objectives and drive the projects mad. You first of all characterize your projects, find out what the baselines are, use those baselines to draw meaningful organizational business objectives. Okay? So your profitability targets, defect removal effectiveness targets, and resource mix targets should be the last thing that you should be worrying about. Okay? You should do a lot of OPP and QPM before you can come up with OPM. And then when there is a performance deviation, after having understood the process inputs, you want to identify the root causes and do something about why there was this exception. That is causal analysis and resolution, right? So this is only half the story, because the key thing is, apart from having a process which defines a process impact, we have people. And there are so many different types of people. And people are the ones who normally resist change. Your computer or your iPhone is not going to crib about iOS 7 being released as a patch with an iOS 7.2. It will easily get installed. But it's people who have to use iOS 7.02 who are going to crib about the fact that the GUI looks different, the functionality looks different, and there's therefore so much more of a human attribute in the so-called realization of the sustenance of the CMMI high maturity objectives. And there's also another important issue that comes into play. If you don't proactively engage individuals who are consciously building that organizational learning and awareness, chances are that minimizing of special and common cause variations are not going to happen. And for purposes of this workshop, we'll define what is a special cause and what is a common cause. Okay? It's not the same thing that we know from what manufacturing gives us. A special cause variation is a cause of variation which can be attributed to something outside the context of your process. Customer changing his requirements, validation environment not being available in the organization. Those are special causes. Common causes are those causes which are attributable to the process in execution by the practitioners. Inadequate domain training, lack of tools, the constant churn in the people, that is attrition. These are common cause variations. Okay? And if you have to kind of sustain process capability, you therefore have to ensure that there is stability and permanence to the process context. And we know that simple changes to teams like SEPG causes a lot of emotive responses in the organization. And the process capability falls. If the head of the SEPG is changed to someone else, you're going to have a different process dynamic. And if individuals do not build the required process capability, organizational training from the 3 constellations where the focus is on knowledge and skills alone is not going to be sufficient. Okay? And therefore, why PCMM? Because PCMM advocates a process-based professional empowerment. And the questions that PCMM actually asks of high maturity is, could there be a set of PCMM process area practices which could complement high maturity implementation? And the answer is yes. And I'll tell you what those 5 are, and you will soon agree with me. Okay? And how is it that we don't have a practice in the CMMI that will help you to sustain the process maturity and process capability? And therefore, if stability is of concern, should we be thinking about the PCMM process areas? Again, the answer will be yes. Okay? Because the notion of organizational learning is highly pronounced in the people CMM. It operates at 2 levels. At the unit level, the focus is on a process area called training and development. And at the organizational level, there's a process area called competency development. And together, they help you to have knowledge retention and knowledge gains. And let's understand that any competency process is with a view to enact a business activity, right? So a competency process without a business activity is a waste. It's like a skill without a context, okay? So that is by far why I think this workshop is going to be focusing on the PCMM aspect. A quick question.